So this week we're taking kind of a bird's eye view to a lot of things that we have talked about in the class and kind of moving on to the broader issues of what it is to do ethnography in the context of the digital world. And I guess the main problem that most people might have if you have no contact with what anthropology is as a whole is that ethnography itself is both the process and the result of the work that is done in anthropology. And that is kind of annoying, but it's also very representative of what it is to do ethnography, that it is very much a process and that the result of it may not necessarily look like any particular format. In other words, it could be anything really, as long as it does the process of looking at people's issues or people's lives or people's processes themselves, I suppose. So in the Hanging Out book, there is this approach to ethnography that is mentioned. Using an ethnographic approach means that we work to understand how media and technology are meaningful to people in the context of their everyday lives. We do not see media or technology as determining or impacting society, culture, or individuals as an external force with its own internal logic, but rather as embodiments of social and cultural relationships that in turn shape and structure our possibilities for social action and cultural expression. It follows that we do not see the content of the media or the media platforms, TV, books, games, etc., as the most important variables for determining social or cognitive outcomes. For example, we look at how video game play is part of youth social lives, where it is situated in the home, how parents regulate play with the games, or how youth identify with the content and characters. So essentially, the ethnographic process allows you to ask those questions, and it can come kind of in the middle of things, if you will, that you are looking at a thing that is happening, and you will start your ethnography from the point of view of that thing that you have started. And in that context, the idea of ethnography has not changed much from the regular way in which people have done the job of anthropology for about 100 years now. E.B. Tyler was pointing out that strict method has, however, yet only been introduced over part of the anthropological field in 1889. There has still to be overcome a certain not unkindly hesitancy on the part of men engaged in the precise operations of mathematics, physics, chemistry, biology to admit that the problems of anthropology are amenable to scientific treatment. It is my aim to show that the development of institutions may be investigated as on the basis of tabulation and classification. In other words, when Tyler was doing the job of anthropology, or at least this ancestor or ancestral version of anthropology, there was no set method, and especially not a strict one. So his contribution, we have mentioned before, as rather imperfect, of course, from his own point of view. But the contribution was to really turn this study of people into a scientific basis. And at the time, that was very much a concern for most people who did any kind of science, mostly social sciences, to be considered as a legitimate science, of course. And the context for him was to make as many systems as possible and observable systems as well. So the basis of tabulation and classification, that is, putting things in a table and classifying the things in the table, is basically the way that he found to make sense of culture as a whole. And for all of its shortcomings, there are still many people who will do those things by putting numbers and putting numbers into tables and putting those tables into some kind of system to understand how people are living their lives. And that's what we would tend to call quantitative anthropology. Something that is a lot more common in Europe, especially because Europe has a much more structuralist version of sciences in general. But he points out that the way that he did his research was, I have been collecting the evidence found among between 300 and 400 peoples, ranging from insignificant savage hordes to great cultured nations. The particular roles have been scheduled out in tables so as to ascertain what may be called the quote-unquote adhesions of each custom, showing which peoples have the same custom and from what other customs accompany it or lie apart from it. From the recurrence or absence of these customs, it will be our business to infer their dependence on causes acting over the whole range of mankind. And in that case, this is very much just a survey that he is doing through these numbers, putting those people into tables or putting these specific customs into tables allows them to have this bird's eye view of the culture as a whole and to put that thing into some sensible order that would allow somebody to make sense of the differences between these people and those people. So here, of course, as I have pointed out before, but it bears reminding, Tyler is very much looking down on non-Western people who he calls insignificant savage hordes compared to great cultured nations. And as a result, the criteria that he used to create those tables are the problem much more than the method itself, that he did his research based on an idea of categories that he got from his own view as opposed to the categories that he could get from the people themselves. And in fact, Tyler did his research by looking at books written by other people, not by himself, and not his own observations. So, that kind of adds another layer of distance to hold to all this. But the larger context that we are seeing here is larger definitions that we have used so far in this class for the past 7 weeks of the definitions of culture and government and whatever, things that are defined to be very wide and to be adaptable outside of the specific cultural context of literally any person, of course, that it doesn't matter if a person is using a specific mode of government or a specific form of religion, those things are still religious systems for our purposes, and they can be studied on the same terms, whether it's a big religion or a big political system or a small religion or a small political system. And at this point, when Tyler is making a difference between the insignificant savage hordes and the great cultured nations, it's really a matter of scale much more than anything else. But as I started this class, and by this class, I mean in the first week of classes, the way that we are doing anthropology now is more based on an American school created by Franz Boas, especially. And Boas, of course, defining anthropology, puts it in the widest terms possible. It might appear that the domain of anthropology, or the science of man, is preoccupied by a whole array of sciences. The anthropologist who studies bodily form is confronted by the anatomist who has spent centuries in researches on the gross form and minute structure of the human body. The physiologist and the psychologist devote themselves to inquiries into the functioning of body and mind. Is there then any justification for the anthropologist to claim that he can add to our fund of knowledge? And so you see kind of the same concern that Boas has with having anthropology being understood as a science, really, as much more than just gathering a bunch of facts about people. And of course, this is very much the context of maybe impeding on another form of science that already exists, whether it is the physiologist, psychologist, or anybody else. And the larger context here is still a matter of making your science known as its own science. But Boas continues that there is a difference between the work of the anthropologist and that of the anatomist, physiologist, and psychologist. They deal primarily with the typical form and function of the human body and mind. Minor differences, such as appear in any series of individuals, are either disregarded or considered as peculiarities without particular significance for the type, although sometimes suggestive of its rise from lower forms. This is kind of what Tyler was pointing out. The interest centers always in the individual as a type and in the significance of his appearance and functions from a morphological, physiological, and psychological point of view. And so Boas points out, on the contrary, the individual appears important only as a member of a racial or social group. So the idea here is that there is this trend that you find in most other sciences to find the systems and to discard the things that do not fit the system. Here, the way that Boas has defined anthropology and the way that we do those things is to look at the various differences that might exist in all those groups. And racial groups that were very much a concern back when Boas was writing, because of course there were a lot of people trying to prove that specific racial groups corresponded with specific cultural practices, and we know that's not the case now. But the same appears to social groups as well, that you might think that you can observe a social group based on the system of practices that they have. But Boaz, from his point of view, starts with the fact that there is a variety of things and that end up defining a group. And of course, for our purposes, we are looking at the full variety, the whole range of ways in which people might do a thing or another. And those become the practices, those become the social groups. Those are the things that anthropologists study, not from the system that is already existing. And of course, the creation of a discipline such as anthropology kind of fits this format here, is that there are certainly sciences that exist, and those sciences have their systems to work with science. Anthropology started a new system, and as a result of that, starts to observe people in a very different lens. And the number one way in which this was achieved, after Boas especially, was the way of immersion into the cultures, or what has been called more specifically participant observation. Our considerations thus indicate that the goal of ethnographic fieldwork must be approached through three avenues, says Malinowski in 1926. Malinowski was British. He was in the UK, but had this approach to anthropology that was very much the more modern way. The organization of the tribe or the anatomy of its culture must be recorded in firm, clear outline. The method of concrete statistical documentation is the means through which such an outline has been given. So part of the scientific construct here is to make the general picture of exactly who we are talking about and where those things are. And of course, for our context in social sciences, that means pretty much putting people wherever they are, in a place, in a country, in a nation, in a forest, or whatever those things are. This is the scientific facts that we can gather about where people are. And you can certainly describe those environmental variables as far as the systems, as far as the pre-existing science conditions that exist. And then Malinowski points out within this frame the imponderabilia of actual life, or the imponderables, if you will, and the type of behavior have to be filled in. They have to be collected through minute, detailed observations in the form of some sort of ethnographic diary, made possible by close contact with native life. And so that means very literally looking at people in their environment and observing how those relations play out. And that, of course, this will come up as a form of note-taking, essentially, that you gather as much data as you can on the fly, and that will happen in a much less structured way, because when people live their lives, it is often not in structured ways, and those types of behaviors can be recorded to a certain extent, but they have to be recorded as they happen before they are classified into this particular form or that particular form. In this case, what he calls here some sort of ethnographic diary is just a matter of note-taking that lets you remember where a thing happened, how a thing happened, and when a thing happened, so that you can probably reorganize those things later at a later date. Sorry, last but not least, he says a collection of ethnographic statements, characteristic narratives, typical occurrences, items of folklore, and magical formula has to be given as a corpus inscriptionum, as documents of native mentality. And that means, of course, using those first-hand observations here. So ethnographic statements, characteristic narratives, typical occurrences, items of folklore, essentially those physical proofs, whatever you might have, of what is happening. Now, for our context in the digital world, the imponderabilia of actual life is plentiful, and it is very easy to see. The ethnographic statements will be a very different research group, especially because gathering the evidence of what people are doing in their lives is very different when they are living online, and especially with the context of having those persona, as we have mentioned it before in this class. So the larger context, as Malinowski points out, is these three lines of approach lead to the final goal, of which an ethnographer should never lose sight. This goal is briefly to grasp the native's point of view, his relation to life, to realize his vision of his world. We have to study man, and we must study what concerns him most intimately, that is, the hold which life has on him. In each culture, the values are slightly different. People aspire after different aims, follow different impulses, yearn after a different form of happiness. In each culture, we find different institutions in which man pursues his last life interest, different customs by which he satisfies his aspirations, different codes of law and morality which reward his virtues or punish his defections. To study the institutions, codes, and customs, or to study the behavior or mentality without the subject desire of feeling by what these people live, of realizing the substance of their happiness, is, in my opinion, to miss the greatest reward which we can hope to obtain from the study of man. And so that is kind of a nice way to put it, those realizing the substance of their happiness, kind of doing those things that make people happy to a certain sense. And, sometimes it is very meaningless as you see it from the outside, but sometimes it is very meaningful to themselves. And it is a result of that, that is part of looking at the minutia, as the imponderables, as those things that people may not necessarily think about all day long, those unstructured moments in everyday life. And this is where you see people acting as their quote unquote realist, if you will. This is not particularly real in the sense that it is still structured by some form of culture, but this is what we are looking at here. We are looking at the ways in which people are kind of methodically doing things that do not seem to have a method. And the participant observation here, or looking at people in their quote unquote natural environment. Of course, we have defined how natural or unnatural things can be, or what it says here, realizing his vision of his world, is really entering the context of people's lives on a day-to-day basis. And for our case, of course, the digital worlds can be entered and visible very much from the outside, but that doesn't mean that it is experienced from the vision of the people who are participating in them. And looking from the outside in into the vision of somebody else is not sufficient to understand how those systematic things come into play, how those specific interactions will turn into maybe new forms of action, new form of living, or, as it's pointing out here, the substance of their particular happiness.